Bien, pendant que les panélistes s'installent,
while the panelists sit down, I will explain how we're going to proceed.
C'est un exercice d'équilibriste que d'arriver à faire
tricky balancing act
la synthèse de tous les ateliers. Donc, bon, évidemment, Patricio et moi
summary of all the workshops which have taken place. Patrick and myself know that, of course, we are not going to be able to be comprehensive in our summary, but of course it is only a summary, it is not an exhaustive restitution of what went on. We will try to make use of the reports, and thank you to everyone who has given us the reports, and thank you to the chairman from the different workshops who have given us the reports, which give us information about the exchanges which took place this morning and also the various debates during the day. And so we will try to make an overall summary of what went on today with a few points which will give us an outlook for the rest of the conference. And after this summary, we will invite the panelists to give us their perspectives and their observations about these conclusions. Of course, we're not going to ask them to summarize the debates, but rather to give us their observations regarding these conclusions. And if we have any time left, of course, we will invite the audience to participate so that you can also add to what will be a very partial and incomplete summary.
Patricio, si tu m'y autorises, je vais peut-être
Patrice, if you will let me start, I will get to the heart of the matter.
On a évidemment l'exercice est pas évident et on s'est dit que c'était peut-être pas la meilleure idée.
Of course, it's a tricky exercise that we had to do, and it's not easy to take stream by stream and area by area,
mais plutôt de dégager 5
but rather to
conclusions.
Make 5 main areas of conclusion emerge. The first group of conclusions concerns the idea that we have come here not only to establish main strategic axes and big perspectives, but also that all of you, through the workshops, have come to add tools to your toolbox for creation, for monitoring, for management of MPAs. That exchange is fundamental, and I will try to give you a few key points
pouvoir être mis en évidence.
Which seem to be worth highlighting.
Le premier d'entre eux, c'est les opportunités nouvelles qu'offrent les technologies.
The new opportunities which are presented by the new technologies. New technologies are, of course, rapidly evolving. We have new techniques which emerge maybe not every day, but quite regularly. For example, aerial photography based on cheaper and cheaper support platforms like drones, for example, 3D acoustic modeling, for example. And, of course, what we need to do is optimize the use of these technologies by developing a multi-platform and multi-sensor technologies linked in with satellite imagery and so on. And, of course, these technologies make us ask a question. We were talking about a toolbox, and the question is how to transfer these toolboxes to the users. This requires a lot of knowledge, and we need to harness financing to ensure the spread of these technologies to countries which are less wealthy. And of course, many other areas of exchange in this very wide topic of toolbox, and I won't be able to quote them all. What I would nevertheless like to highlight is that it was clearly said that we need to develop approaches and tools to get ready to develop MPAs for the high seas, which of course present specific challenges both on a scientific level and in terms of what's at stake, and of course in terms of the legal framework. These exchanges, these discussions regarding the toolbox must also be put into a network where they are local, regional, national, international. And let's hope that impact will have promoted the emergence of new networks.
Et puis un message que je tiens à répercuter aussi d'un Knowledge Café sur les données anciennes, la nécessité dans les outils de maintenir, de reconstituer des données historiques.
Reconstitute historic data,
un peu simplifié de dire ne jetons pas les
and
données
in a very
anciennes à la
simplified
poubelle,
way
mais
to say let's not throw away all data, but let's make the most of them, and let's make an effort to rebuild
du recul historique pour notre vision
the historic data for a wider vision of ecosystems. So that was for the first topic
Patricio.
Regarding the toolbox. Patricia? Patrice?
Merci. We are going to look now how to fill in knowledge gaps and how to complete the networks that are working towards obtaining this new knowledge. There is a priority, a geographical priority. We have detected that the deep sea, the mer profonde, it is a new place where we are working very intensely. We need to complete that. And also there was a mention, a very explicit mention on the need to complete the future opportunities that the list under the Convention of 1972 of UNESCO, Heritage Convention, could offer. So in order to complete the networks, there is a lot of information on migratory species, but there is also the need, and this is very important that we have our colleague from the Convention on Migratory Species, to consider the full range of these species. You know, the Convention does do that, exert the protection over the whole range. And this is also emerging in other contexts. For example, when you are talking of the reservoirs of carbon in the coastal zone associated to what we call the blue carbon initiatives, we also need to look at the full range of those deposits and not only those that are within marine protected areas. They do have, there is a value to identify those reservoirs and in order to put them in circulation in the different modes of exchange. It is not just an issue of valorizing them and put them into the RED plus system. That's an issue, of course, but it's not only that. We need the information on its own merit. So therefore, the full range, it is important. Marine protected areas are an important area of conservation, but in many cases, we need to extend the knowledge beyond the areas. There is a need for increasing the complementary nature of the large sites with the small sites. We're starting to think in terms of the networks and to go and use the methods of spatial planning for analyzing potential conflicts and optimize scenarios. In this context, it's also very important, as I already mentioned, taking into account the migratory species. Now, there is a new emerging issue when we talk of more dynamic environments, particularly pelagic environments. How do we protect better pelagic environments? And there is a new area emerging there on how to look at this much more mobile concept, criteria, to define areas under protection. So this is extending the concept of a site-based tool to integrate it with more dynamic type of tools. And you just can think immediately on the type of dynamic pool methodology that is classic to fisheries. So you want to complement the management strategies using the classical fisheries approaches with site approaches. You need to, you can allow for certain degrees of freedom on how to use the site approaches in this context. Mobile areas, protected areas are an issue that has been discussed, and it's an interesting issue to follow up. There is still a need, and this has been mentioned in more than one place, the need to organize and realize that there is so much that we can do by the application of numerical modeling. We cannot expect to have all the problems solved through proxy, the modeling of proxy approaches or proxy variables. Eventually we will have to go out there and collect information that is missing. And in a sense, there is a room for these large scale efforts of collecting new information. And it was an issue that was thoroughly discussed at the lunch plenary as well by the panelists. This also, of course, links very closely to the research in the deep sea. And in connection to this modeling, there is a new issue. We were tracking what was the workshops telling us in terms of connectivity. There was the issue was discussed specifically. It is an interdisciplinary question of connectivity. There were contributions there. And the recommendation that came from that group was that it was a special need to treat the connectivity issue at the local scale and at the regional scale. So to factor in the scale into the studies of connectivity. And probably this has an impact on how we start moving outward in the designs of network, making use of the existing MPAs towards networking them. And a comment was made with respect to how to integrate climate change issues into the management of marine protected areas. And the answer from the workshop was it is quite complex. The participants there found that the issue is not a simple one, but it's necessary to really start doing it. And this probably links, I was sampling the workshop, so I spent full time participating in the blue carbon workshop, and that was a very good case in which the detailed analysis of all the tools valuing blue carbon, coastal carbon better, were examined there in some detail. But the point at the end was that you really need to apply. There is not a single method fits all the sizes. It doesn't. You need to choose very carefully the method that you're going to apply to your particular region. Different mangroves forests are quite different in terms of the retention and preservation of carbon sinks, carbon deposits, and therefore it is not exactly the same. Seagrasses are different. Salt marshes are different. So in that sense, the methodology, although based on the same principle, needs to be adapted and very focused onto the particular cases. And as already mentioned, the value is not only in the market value of the carbon. Besides, the market price of the carbon went down from $15 to probably $3 or maybe $2 today. So we have another very favorable situation after an evaluation of the potential benefits there. So there is a value, an intrinsic value of doing that work, and the tools are available for doing it. Thank you.
Merci, Patricio. Le troisième grand ensemble de conclusions concerne le dialogue entre les disciplines, la nécessité de s'appuyer sur les cultures, les savoirs traditionnels, et de développer de façon générale des approches basées sur les sciences humaines et sociales.
Human and social science-based approaches. And by way of introduction, there were two workshops dedicated to this important topic, which is the evaluation of
ecosystem services. And in passing, we also need to bear in mind that this approach was a real lever for dialogue between the different disciplines, and a lot of cost-benefit analysis of these ecosystem systems, and also the financial aspects and the assessment of environmental factors. There is a lot at stake resting on this approach, and a real requirement to raise awareness about them, raise awareness of the managers of MPAs. They need to better understand these various approaches. Another point which was also developed in our workshops regards customary management. It exists, and it should be better known. It should be made the most of, especially in the aim of achieving the Aichi Target 11 objectives. And we should take into account this system of management based on customs. Of course, the social question does not regard only the economy. Of course, I'm not going to give a long list of the different disciplines concerned, but simply we said that science and sociology and anthropology and the concept of ecology of the landscape should also be applied to the oceans. This is not particularly new, but it is nevertheless a field which is undergoing development. In the assessment of different types of knowledge, traditional knowledge, local knowledge. This was also mentioned in the introduction this morning, and it came back and forth in the different workshops, taking into account the indicators of the health of the marine environment, and we need to develop specific indicators. So that is all I had to say regarding interdisciplinary dialogue and making the most of traditional knowledge.
One important issue was to look at the assessment of what is already in place, how we can conduct the assessment of the different areas. And we confirmed that there is the classic sort of evaluation, the ecological evaluation, the effects of the marine protected areas, but we are lacking of the methodology. Certainly, it was confirmed by the participants in the different workshops that we don't have ready to apply and be used a full range of methodologies for the efficiency of the networks. So there are many efforts to improve the methodologies to assess the effectivity, the efficacy of the networks. And this is a subject that needs to be further developed by research and work in the field. It will be important to have an assessment ex ante of the projects for new MPAs, and to link the assessment of the MPAs in terms of the objectives laid down in the regional plans of management plans. So it is important first to know somebody's requested very loud and clear in one message, pointed message, say it would be very nice to have, together with the map of where the MPAs of the world are, associate to them which of those have a management plan. And we could have a look at the management plan. That's not available, that information is not easily available today. By the way, somebody pointed to me that the number that appears in the map that you all have in your bags, it is a map on the marine protected area that says that today we already have 3% of the areas of the world covered by MPA. It's a new number. We are still in many places, particularly many governments, stick to the 1.8%. And I think impact, one of the things that impact should really ratify, it is that we are on the 3% already. And we still have a long way, but we are already on the 3%. and it's an important point to sort of sanctify here in the plenaries of the meeting. We must be selective when we do the follow-up. We need to really categorize the different indicators. There is a full range of different indicators emerging for different purposes, and sometimes there are too many. We really need to streamline the process of follow-up, and in that sense, it is important that we do that exercise of prioritizing, looking at exactly which are the ones that are more relevant, and to do the follow-up of those in the first place. And we need to extend the follow-up at the regional scale in the long term. We cannot survive with just a point-to-point in time assessment. We need to really look at the medium to long term to have a fair view of where we are. There are new areas in which assessment needs to be developed. Il y a eu un atelier in workshop. There was a workshop very interesting on recreation fishing. How do you say that? Sport fishing, and it compared very clearly the impact of that with respect to the small-scale fisheries in the coastal zone, and in that sense, again, there was a request to look at that, first of all, to include them in the assessment of MPAs, include the impact of sport fishing, and to make a comprehensive assessment of those activities together with the more classical ones like small-scale fishing or artisanal fishing. The other aspect here is to improve and look at the quality of governance. In this heading, we really need to look at the inclusiveness of what the governance mechanisms are doing. Do we have all the stakeholders that should be participating? Are they actively engaged in the governance? That associated with the next point, that is the acceptability of MPAs by society at large, but by the local communities in the first place. And of course, if we are able to assess economic benefits, we will have a much heavier argument to be able to convince and create a positive environment to accept the development of MPAs. And again, in this context, was to look at the assessment of, or the potential of marine protected areas in terms of preserving, in terms of protecting the carbon deposit in the coastal zone, the blue carbon issue. And finally, it was underlined, coming from the 2-3 workshops on cultural issues, that somehow we need to really look at the assessments also from the perspective of making full use of the traditional knowledge that is very, very important, very powerful in many regions of the world, and very often is overlooked, and we don't really benefit from the usage of this very important type of knowledge. So that was on this point. Yes.
Merci Patricio. J'essaierai d'être synthétique pour le
Thank
dernier
you, Patricio, and I will try
de conclusions
be fairly
qui
brief for the last main area of
comment
conclusions
assurer la participation
around the
des
question
acteurs
of
et
how
du
to ensure the
public,
participation of the
communiquer, convaincre.
stakeholders and of the public, to
Rappeler,
inform and to convince.
Que si on veut convaincre, il faut
If you
d'abord
want
avoir
to
une bonne
convince,
science et
you
une
first
bonne
of all need to
gestion.
have a good science and good management.
Mais c'est
a bit of a truism.
le point de départ.
That, of course, is the starting point.
Évidemment, on l'a beaucoup dit dans tous les ateliers,
This has
associer
been
les
repeated in
acteurs.
all the workshops that we need to link together the stakeholders and include the stakeholders at all the different stages of marine protected areas to start the project with the involvement of stakeholders right from the start, to take into account appropriation or sense of ownership type questions, for example, the involvement of the local communities, which can be determinant in the success of the MPAs. And when we go out and collect data to go and explain what you're doing and explain the results to the people who live around there and who are the first concerned by what you're doing. It seems obvious, but this is not always done. And then, of course, the inclusion of other types of stakeholders, like people from industry or other areas. And, for example, companies collect data, especially in the high seas, where, of course, knowledge is fundamental.
Il a été aussi souligné le rôle de certaines AMP liées à des projets éducatifs.
Certain MPAs should have roles with regards to education, so we can have MPAs especially dedicated to education projects. I know of at least one project in the Marquise Islands, but I'm sure there are others, and I think we should hail these initiatives.
Dans le succès de l'association avec les acteurs,
in terms of successes, in terms of inclusion with the stakeholders, then of course we're going to describe a bottom-up process, how to make values and visions and ideas of the stakeholders come to the fore, but also know how to go from the top to the bottom and inform about the overall strategy.
Les sciences participatives, on
and there's
en
a last
a
point,
parlé,
the
finalement c'est des démarches qui intègrent tout ça, des démarches globales qui permettent d'associer les parties
It's a
prenantes.
global approach which links together all of the stakeholders. Of course, MPAs are privileged structures for this because we develop probably stronger links than elsewhere with a certain number of stakeholders.
Alors les objectifs des sciences participatives, c'est pas seulement de procurer des connaissances supplémentaires,
gain additional knowledge,
disposer d'une main-d'œuvre pour parler un peu vulgairement d'acquisition de données. Ça
to have a large staff to go and collect data for you. There are many simultaneous objectives. It's the involvement of the stakeholders, their sense of ownership of an overall approach of the MPA, and advantages linked to awareness raising about the environment and environmental education. All this presupposes that we should implement well thought out protocols. This sometimes requires a certain number of constraints, and of course we need to ensure a return of information towards the stakeholders. So those are the main elements of conclusion which Patricio and myself wanted to tell you about. I think Patricio would like to add a few last words before handing over to our panelists. To add to what you just said about the management of MPAs, in the case of the Marquise Islands, that was the education example.
This is a case in which I think it's emblematic because when a local community decided to create a new island, a small island, a new protected area using the traditional methods, they consulted the young, the children, if they would be willing to be the managers of the area. So there is a marine protected area in Polynesia that is now going to be managed by the new generation, by the children. So this is important. I think it's a unique case. And it's quite a challenge, of course, the way they will have the guide and protection of the elders, but they will be in charge. And they really were eager to do this. So it's an important point. We are not only, in doing that, we are also reproducing culture, because in that way, the traditional practice, the traditional methods and traditions are being transmitted so effectively by giving them a hands-on experience. So I find that it's illuminating. So this is why I wanted to mention it. And thank you, and McDonald, for reminding me of this, telling me this at lunchtime. Thank you.
Merci, Patricio.
Thank you, Patricio.
Je me tourne vers les panélistes qui ont voulu nous rejoindre. pour vous demander d'exprimer à votre tour votre point de vue sur, sur ces conclusions d'ensemble et puis peut-être un regard aussi sur la journée, les différents moments auxquels vous avez pu assister, participer, et de dire votre impression, environ 5 minutes par panéliste, si vous voulez bien. En vous excusant aussi, parce que je crois qu'avec Patricio, on a été un petit peu...
because I think Patricio and myself slightly went over a lot of time.
Tout d'abord la parole à Jihyun de la Convention sur la diversité biologique.
The Convention of Biodiversity.
Thank you. Now I'm talking in English only. It's personally a great honor to speak on this important issue between science and policy, especially with Dr. Patricio and also Dr. EHLER, because they have been my inspiration when I started this kind of work more than 20 years ago. So I want to make a personal note first. And I want to start that I really like this title of this theme, for today's theme, which is Science and Knowledge in the Service of Effective Management. And I want to highlight that to make science and knowledge in the service for the management really takes a lot of efforts, because you have to make science and knowledge practical and operational, and you have to consider all these time constraints, resource constraints, also capacity constraints. So at the Secretariat, we are basically at the interface between all these excellent scientific communities. And on one hand, we are tasked to service 193 countries, which are represented mostly by national government. So how to transfer all these knowledges and also this excellent scientific initiative going on various issues surrounding marine protected areas for the use and as a service for parties to implement at their national level and sub-regional level, at the local level, is a great challenge, especially when you have such a small secretariat. So I want to use the example of ecologically or biologically significant marine areas case with the acronym of EPSAS. I was attending different workshops, just hopping around to see the field and also to see how the discussion was going to prepare for this conclusion session. And I heard from many about EPSAS, and it's great because we started this EPSA process only after 2010, and now it's 2013 only. And and the workshop started only in the late 2011. And now I feel like everybody is talking about EPSAS. Some talks with the high expectation, and some talks with over-interpretation, misinterpretation, and some talks with criticism. So we see a lot of these various ranges of perspectives and also questions. When you talk with, for example, fishing agencies in some countries, big fishing countries, they would tell me, they would warn me, I will not have a good time in coming SUBSTA, because basically next SUBSTA will be submitting the EPSA workshop result covering most of the world oceans except the southern part of the ocean and except some areas, some southern part of the areas. So far, since COP9 adopted this EPSA criteria, 7 criteria, which can be very simple to somebody and also very complicated for country participants to apply. But this criteria was adopted, and without really, at the time, we didn't really know how it's going to be applied. And COP10 had such a difficult time in Nagoya to discuss how it's going to be applied, because we cannot just let countries to apply this criteria knowing their capacity need and also the time that will take in terms of building all this scientific capacity. That's why how also COP10 asked the Secretariat to organize this series of regional workshops together with all different international and regional partners. And I want to acknowledge also the help of various scientific partnership, especially Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, which was also led previously by Patricio BERNAL and now with Dr. David Johnson. And with all this support from countries, and scientific groups, we are able to cover so far 75% of world oceans, and applying this criteria, at least to show in very clear manner, it can be very simple polygons, composition of polygons around the world. At least we can tell to the government, this is the area meeting the criteria for ecologically or biological significance. So we have these scientific tools, but at the same time, we have to remember that when COP asked us to do this, it was purely for the scientific advice they want to receive, because they made it very clear that it will be government, the countries, and also internationally, intergovernmentally competent bodies that will apply and also consider the conservation measures using this scientific information. So, of course, we are very happy that this scientific information is available to you for your discussion in terms of addressing Target 11. But at the same time, we have to make it very clear that EFSA is now automatically MPA, and MPA is now automatically EFSA. So I hope you, with that common ground of understanding about this scientific process, which is under CBD, I hope you can continue your discussion on EFSAs, and also let us know how we can help parties in terms of applying all these qualitative aspects of Target 11, because we just had a Substat 17 last week, and there were many parties addressing the concerns that there is not much enough guidance coming from the Secretariat. Although in last COP, the COP asked various international bodies with expertise, including IUCN, asking more guidance to parties in terms of covering this wide range of scope of Target 11. So we are hoping to work closely with all these scientific and also knowledge bodies, and because Secretariat, we have very limited human resources and in terms of various constraints, but we are interface, so if we can work closely, I'm sure we can find ways to help parties to address all these concerns and questions in terms of achieving Target 11. So I think I will stop there, but I will be happy to receive any questions or any further discussion on this. Thank you.
Merci Jihyun pour ce grand panorama des deux démarches de la CDB sur les EPSA.
Initiatives of EPSA. And now I will hand over to Xavier Pastor from Océana.
Good afternoon. My name is Xavier Pastor. I am the Executive Director for Océana in Europe. And first of all, I want to thank IUCN and the French Agents of Marine Protected Areas for giving voice here to the conservation activist movement and being proud of having been appointed to give this voice. Because together with scientists and managers and legislators, I don't know if many legislators are with us here, would be very good that they saw the force that is going out from events like this Congress, and take note for their decisions in the parliaments and the governments. But together with these three other legs and some others, we are part of the force that is moving forward in terms of improving the health of the oceans, and in particular the marine protected areas development. What we do, what Océana does, is a young organization. It's about
10 years old in Europe and a couple of years more in North America. We do, among other things, research expeditions in as many seas of the world as we can afford. And we do what you could call basic scientific research, or even more humbly, basic environmental observation and documentation with divers, with ROVs. And we use that to do, to use it politically, if you can say that. We don't do a research which is academic research, which is subject to peer review. What we do is fact-finding, and then use that for policy achievements. In other words, if we go and with an ROV and with divers, we can document and photograph that in a particular area there is this species, or is this protected coral, or this protected seagrass, or we can show and document and certify that these protected species are in an area that need too much to go through a long process of publication, of peer review. We can go with that to the governments and tell them, look, by law, you have to enforce the conservation and the protection of these areas, very often through a marine protected area designation. So here, I mean, in the few minutes I have, I mean, if I had to send a message to the audience, would be a message that, together with the hope that you get in meetings like that and the really interesting things you hear in the workshops and the advances that seem to be happening, the message would be one of frustration and one of disappointment, because the main sentence would be, the law is in our side, or we are in the side of the law. In environmental organizations, which normally are seen as, you know, problematic activists, normally what happens too often is that we are in a position of, instead of dedicating our time and our resources to promote policy changes that move forward, we have to spend most of our time doing police work, watchdog work, because if the laws that are already in place were applied by the governments, then maybe 50, 60, 70% of our job would be not necessary, and we could devote our time in pushing forward new legislation and new advances. Can put some examples which, despite the fact that the law is in our side, we find that many many specific habitats or species that are protected by law are not enforced in many places, not only in non-developed countries, in very developed countries happens the same. We find situations where this 10% that we are mentioning all the time, which, by the way, as all of us know, it was already delayed from 2010 or 12 to 2020. In the case of the European Union, it's hard law. It's not only a voluntary approach by the signatories of the CBD. It's a directive that forces the European governments to go ahead and get by 2020 this 10% included in their Natura 2000. And we are very slow on that, and some of them are not enforcing at enough speed. So then organizations like Océana has to go to the European Commission, lose our time, our resources, our human and financial resources to go to the European Commission and force them to put pressure on the governments. European Commission doesn't like to upset governments, doesn't like to embarrass them, so we are sometimes back in square one. So is that fair? Is that in a society that should be ruled by law? I don't think that is the case. We have other situations when the Copenhagen Agreement says that we should reduce by 2050 the CO2 emissions by, I think, at 95%, I'm not mistaken, a number like that, to prevent, among other things, acidification. So it's, are we moving in that direction? Are we going fast enough so that in 2050 we will have reduced by 90%, 2020 goal for the European Union? In fisheries legislation, and I will finish with that, in fisheries legislation, there is, for instance, a hard legislation that prohibits bottom trawling on coralligenous or marl or in phanerogams in Europe, and in particular in the Mediterranean Sea. And it's in place since 2006. Still, it's not happening. And the same industry, the same actors that are doing the damage are delaying or stopping the action by the governments to take this legislation forward. The excuse is there is not mapping. When governmental research institutes do the mapping, that this mapping became secret. You cannot access to it. Scientists say, we are scientists, it's not our job to enforce it. The governments don't publish this mapping because the fishing sector don't allow them to publish them, because that would mean that they will have to stop bottom trawling in many areas. So all this is very frustrating. And the last case I want to put here is another one. For instance, is there is a limit to engines for the bottom trawlers in the Mediterranean of 500 horsepower. Most of the boats have 2,000 horsepower. Everybody knows that. They know it, the governments know, and they get away with it without anything. So this is the frustration, because when we go then to the governments, to the international institutions, to the conventions that see how their regulations are being violated, it's very difficult to move forward. And I don't want to finish without reminding all of you that there are 30 friends of Greenpeace arrested in Russia for 1 month and a half almost, and they are being asked 15 years in prison for a peaceful protest against oil drilling in the Arctic, and we should not forget them. And whatever any of you have in your power to solve that, to help to solve that situation, would be very appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier, for that testimony. Very, very timely. Now is the time for my good friend Gilles BOEUF. Nous avons fait notre connaissance 20 ans avant au Chili.
I think we met, was it 20 years ago in Chile? We were fighting then for democracy back there. Yes, that was in fact more than 25 years ago. Doesn't make us any younger. I'd like to thank the organizers. I was in Monaco today, in fact, to talk about the scientific problems of the Principality, the deep-sea corals, the coral reefs, polar ecosystems, and marine economy. As you see, I've come very quickly from Monaco to Marseille to join you here this evening, and I'm speaking French so as to vary the language a bit. I'm here not only because I represent the IPBS office, but also I'm the president of one of the largest museums of natural history in the world. And it's true that for a long time now, in Paris, for 4 centuries now, we've been looking at these questions of marine biodiversity, marine environments, and also, of course, the questions of protection and preservation of the ecosystems linked linked to the oceans. So a word or two to remind you of what the ocean is today. On the surface, it represents 71.8% of the Earth's surface. That's a figure we hear often, but it's more interesting to calculate the volume. And the volume of the ocean is 99% of the whole of the volume available for life on Earth. And today, when we look at the known species, we have approximately 2 million species, living species, which are known and which are represented in museums. Viruses, bacteria, unicellular creatures, fungi, plants, animals, and we have something like 235,000 species in the oceans. So a larger volume, but fewer known species. But of course, some of these species are very ancient. We can look at the whole history of life in the oceans, and I often study these aspects of things. Originally, life was present only in the oceans, in different forms, at different periods, in different places. Something like 450 million years ago, then life came up onto the continents, and life then expanded very rapidly. But the ocean still has the same number of species for many, many years. So fewer species, but very ancient species, which are very interesting to study when we look at the history of life on Earth. And today, of course, we exploit these species in different ways. Today, I think there are 3 major events underway. We've discussed some of them already. We've talked about the acidification of the oceans. This is a very important issue. We talked about that a great deal in Monaco yesterday and today. A whole lot of work is being done on acidification. The ocean is 30% more acid than it was a century ago, whereas over 100 million years, its acidity had not changed. The temperature is increasing. I live on the shores of the Mediterranean, and I can see this change on the eastern end of the Mediterranean in particular, less so in the western end because of the exchanges through the Straits of Gibraltar. And then with the work of the GIEC and the IPCC, we saw that maybe the temperature rise forecast has been slightly lowered, but the rise in ocean temperatures is going to be even greater than expected. And that should be of great importance to us today when we're talking about marine protected areas. We can talk about other aspects. Technology, yes, we need to use technology, but it's a question of cost. Aerial observation costs a great deal. We've worked with the protected areas, the Marquise, the Gambia areas, and so on. Aerial surveillance is extremely interesting, but it costs a lot. Of course, there are now drones available and things like that. All that is extremely important. And then the marine observation stations. Over 160 years now, we've been observing the marine life. The oldest is in Concarneau in France, which dates back to about 1860. And then there are stations in the Mediterranean like Naples, Villefranche, Banyuls, Marseille, and then in the Atlantic Ocean, Roscoff, and then around the British Isles, Lowestoft, Plymouth, with a large number of people who've worked here. And in the United States, of course, and in Canada, and now in Asia too. Many, many people who for a long time have been observing the marine environment and archiving data. These data are precious. You can't talk about change unless you have a starting point and a final point, and you need to measure change over a long period of time for it to be meaningful. So making use of these data, reprocessing them, integrating them into modern processing technology, all this is extremely important for us at the present time. And then the deep sea, Montego Bay, we've talked about the surfaces of the ocean, but then there's the deep sea, the high seas too. We don't know very much about the depths of the ocean. We've only explored 1 or 2 points of the depths of the ocean. There are enormous areas which apparently are rather monotonous, cold, dark, and then of course the cold areas or the hydrothermal sources where there is a profusion of life. We find a biomass equivalent to that we find along the coastline. And today we think it's possible to exploit all this. I think that here, when we talk about conservation and protection, we need to be thoroughly aware that it's not only the coastline that needs to be protected, however important it may be, but 55% of human beings live along the coasts. There are problems because of the destruction of the ecosystems, pollution, of course, contamination, and then dissemination of predatory species, and of course overpopulation. optimizing scenarii, problems of conflicts. We've talked about these two. This is fundamental. We've also talked about migratory species, which are extremely important for us because they form a link between the continent and the oceans. Eels, salmon, for example, all these stocks are now under threat today. The eel, which was a very familiar fish in Western Europe, it was even regarded as a pest at one time, as if nature had invented pests to trouble human beings. But now eels are disappearing. There are only 4% remaining compared to the population of 50 years ago in Western Europe. Climate change, exploitation, everything is changing. They are very good sentinels to show what is happening. We've talked about climate change and the management of all this. All this is extremely important. You can see the effects of climate change already today, but it's going to be much worse than you expected. In 2020, 2030, 2040, we shall see important changes affecting the marine environment. And then we talked about the dialogue between different scientific disciplines. This too is important. We need cross-cutting approaches. I'm at the head of a major museum. I work with people who are physicists, chemists, molecular biologists. All this is vital to demonstrate what the current state of the ocean is. And then we need other disciplines from the human and social sciences. We need to talk with sociologists, anthropologists, economists, and maybe even philosophers. Let's not forget that we need to work on the future when we talk about the coastal and high seas ecosystems. So a cross-cutting approach is vital. But this is something that we don't teach to our students. But we should do this. It's essential not only to reveal the current state of affairs, but also to create better management systems. Everybody agrees we have to change, but how are we going to change? That's the important question. And then we talked about sentinels. I'll skip over this. And then the changes in marine protected areas. We talked about 1.8%, perhaps tomorrow 10%, I don't know, but we need to set up these areas. Let's not forget one thing, however. We can create reserves. It's not too difficult to do. It's setting aside land or protected areas. We have coastal systems for the most part today. We haven't gone very far out to sea. But even if you look at the system, if you protect it, if you love these systems, you try to protect these areas in the best possible situations, you may still lose them. Why will you lose them? Well, because of these global changes that we've talked about. Changes in temperature, changes in acidity, also changes in styles of exploitation and the arrival of harmful species. Even if you protect your zones, you may still lose them. We have to fight against these global changes. It's not just a question of climate change. There are others too, which we mentioned earlier. Then we need to work with the various players. I don't know how we can manage fish stocks without fishermen, hunting without hunters. How can we deal with all these questions without talking to people? It's sometimes difficult to talk to people. There are conflicts everywhere. The economy is there to help us, provided the economy is not governed by greed. And I want to stress this point. If we all bear in mind the fact that we need to maintain humanity in a good state, and in order to do that, we have to work with everybody. We have to get everybody to work together. People say you want to save the planet. No, the planet couldn't care less about the human population. What we have to save is the well-being of human beings on this planet. Let me conclude then by talking about this cross-cutting aspect and the players. I believe in educational programs. I believe in working with children. I believe in participative sciences, participatory programs. We've applied these to the marine environment now, and I think it's essential to have joint protocols, properly adapted. We should work in two ways. The citizens should talk to research workers, and scientists should talk to citizens. We should work together. It's not just a question of having new knowledge. I say sometimes the citizens are everywhere all the time, but as a research worker, I can't be everywhere. I can't be present all the time. So that's one aspect of things. But then we need to exploit the results in common, and we need to share them. It's easy to attract somebody. It's much more difficult to capture that person's long-lasting loyalty. And then the global relays we were talking about. We thought the ocean was vast, indestructible, but we now realize that
on chalute aujourd'hui la moitié de tous
We are now
les plateaux
trawling
continentaux.
something like half
On
all
a
the continental
extirpé en
shelves.
15 ans,
In
entre
15
50
years,
et
we've
90%
removed
de
between
tous les
50
grands
and
poissons pélagiques.
90% of all
L'humain
the
peut faire ça.
major
Il a les moyens pour
fish
faire ça.
species.
Donc, si on arrive
We now have
effectivement
the
tous ensemble
technological
à
means
se
to
battre
do
pour
this.
ce même
But
objectif,
if we can all fight
on
together
manque
for
les
the
chances
same
pour
goal,
réussir. Mais il faut
then we
commencer
still
tout de
have
suite.
some chances of succeeding. But we need to start
Gilles.
straight away. Thank you very much, Gilles.
Il s'en fout de la planète, c'est ça que vous avez dit. Hein,
Information about the planet,
C'est vrai,
that's what you
voilà.
said. The planet couldn't care less. It's human beings that count.
Now, my friend from the Convention of Migratory Species, Lyle, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Patricio, and thanks so much to the organizers for inviting CMS to be part of this panel and also to be participating in this marvelous Congress. I think this is probably the first time that our global convention has been represented in a function like this, and it's really important to be here. And it's also very heartening, I think, to be walking around through the exhibitions and seeing all of the displays and pictures of migratory species, which our convention basically sets out to conserve and manage. I want to pick up on François's point about tools in the toolbox, because I think it's very important. We hear a lot about the Convention on Biological Diversity's process with EPSAs and the like, and basically the CBD is really one of the big players in biodiversity conservation, the big global international treaty dealing with biodiversity conservation. You may not know too much about the Convention on Migratory Species, though, and I'd just like to take a little bit of an opportunity, if you allow me, just to introduce us. It's a global biodiversity-related convention. It's one of the 6. It came into force in 1983, and it actually has its inception in the Stockholm Convention in 1972, when countries recognized that migratory species need to be conserved and sustainably used through cooperative approaches across a migratory range. And I think one of the important considerations and values added of our convention is that we try to encourage not only individual national level actions, but we provide a platform for countries to come together and collaborate and coordinate their activities across a migratory range. We take this migratory range approach. And this is quite unique. Within the legal and institutional regimes that we have already in place. I should say that I'm a little bit of an old hand with CMS. I stepped away to become the legal advisor to the Biodiversity Convention for 6 years, and now I've come back and I run the CMS Abu Dhabi office. It's our biggest regional office, and we work on coordinating some of the smaller agreements under the CMS framework. And CMS is a framework convention. It provides the basis for countries, like-minded countries, to come together and negotiate and ultimately implement additional legally binding and non-legally binding international agreements. And in my office, in particular, we're coordinating an MOU dealing with dugongs. And we're working very actively within the Indo-Pacific range state countries to try to direct some support to implement our MOU across the migratory range. And in fact, we're very hopeful that within a few months we're going to have a GEF project working on dugongs and seagrass communities. And some countries in the room and some partners in the room are here and probably could speak more to you about that. The point I'd like to make, though, is that CMS works across a variety of different scales. And we've heard, I think, in the workshops today, the need to work across different scales. We've heard about local and regional. We also have to work across ocean basin type scales, particularly if we want to try to look at pelagic systems and make the connection between conservation activities which are happening within the limits of national jurisdiction and beyond. Because migratory species, and we have 80 species listed on CMS whose range includes areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, they're this living thread that Gilles had mentioned. It's a connection between terrestrial areas and also other ecosystems. So we need the tools in place, and I'd like to offer that CMS really is a tool, both within and beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, to help get us there. And next year is our next Conference of Parties. I do think that the outputs of this Congress could be very effectively tailored into perhaps some policy-making type resolutions within CMS to raise the stakes, as it were, on marine protected areas and their importance to marine migratory species. I'd like to say also that one of the things that I think I've realized today is the importance of visualizing where migratory species are. Now, when I first started out with CMS in 2002, and then I stepped away in 2007, the satellite tracking technologies just were not as very well advanced as they are now. And it's incredibly powerful for policymakers who are trying to make the leap into making good policies and decision making to be able to see where these animals are coming and going from. And so that they realize that they're common biological resources, they're shared. There's actually a common heritage of these animals. And so, I'd just like to say that one of the most important tools that we have within my forum, I think, and hopefully within the other areas that colleagues are working in, is the possibility to bring together the data which is out there, try to mobilize the data which is still hiding, and we need to help make data more available and shareable in these processes, and to help policymakers visualize where the animals are, where they're going to, and how we all have a stake in conserving these. So I think with that, I'd like to close.
Thank you, Lyle. I think that we certainly have overrun the time. We have derelict in our duties with my co-chair. We haven't been a good timekeepers. But now closing, but EHLER, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you, Patricio. I'll try to be brief and not take too long before some interesting sessions and drinks. So it's difficult for me to sit here and not say that science and research is not good. I'm representing the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and I spent most of my professional career with NOAA. So these are both science organizations, so science is good. I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm going to say. Some science is better than others, and certainly there are some results of research and science programs that are more useful to management than others as well. And I think that the topics that we had today are mostly in the latter category, trying to find research results that are useful for management. Not all science is natural science, and I think it was heartening to see a lot of topics on the program today that were certainly more in the realm of social science than natural science. That's a good development, because thinking about why communities don't like to have marine protected areas imposed on them, why we need to consider cultural and heritage kinds of considerations when we plan and manage these kinds of areas. These are questions that are in the realm of social sciences, and certainly we want to encourage more of that. There are a couple of things that were said in the summary that I had a few comments on. Patricio, you said that, the numerical models are needed, and I certainly agree with that, and we need to figure out better ways to employ them in ways, again, that produce useful results for management as well as for science. I mean, a lot of numerical modeling is done for science, and that's okay. But these kinds of tools can also produce information, again, at different scales for management as well, and I think that needs some attention. We have to recognize that we could have all of the best models in the world and all the best information in the world and still make terrible decisions with respect to managing the environment. So it's very much a political, cultural, social problem as it is a science and information issue. And I think we need to do more work and think about that. Patricio, you also said that we don't have enough information or knowledge to proceed with evaluating marine protected areas or the network that we have. I disagree strongly with that. I think we have a lot of information on how to do this. It's come largely from thinking about evaluating development programs, other types of environmental programs, and even marine programs. About 10 years ago, NOAA and IUCN and WWF developed a manual on how to evaluate marine protected areas. It's been widely used, widely accepted, and been generally useful, I think, in terms of evaluation. So I think the field of evaluation and evaluating MPAs is pretty far along, and we can certainly do better, but we know how to do it. So we just need to apply these things. I'm not sure we need another manual on how to, or guideline on how to do it. The problem that we have in evaluation is we do lack often management plans. A lot of marine protected areas are not based on any kind of a plan. And even within plans, one of the biggest problems is we still are terrible, both in the MPA community as well as the marine spatial planning community that I'm very familiar with now, in writing objectives. We just don't know how to specify what we want to do and where we want to be in 10 years or 20 years. And until we get better at doing some of these fairly standard and necessary kinds of issues, until we get better at doing those, we're always going to have a difficult time saying that we're managing effectively or efficiently or even equitably. So we need to do a better job in terms of planning and management, but we do know how to evaluate whether or not it's a good job or not. What didn't we hear very much about? I think that's important to think about in terms of planning the next impact and planning future meetings like this. I didn't hear much about cumulative effects. I think that's a big one, and it's not, again, an area that some people at least have not thought about, but we don't have a lot of experience in evaluating cumulative effects. It's not impossible to do that, we're just getting started, but we want to think about cumulative effects on marine protected areas, and in some ways that's why new areas like marine spatial planning are important to marine protected area management, because MSP, marine spatial planning, represents the other 97% that we have to consider when we're trying to figure out how to manage MPAs effectively. We didn't hear much about trade-off analysis either, and that's important, because how do you begin to value things like ecosystem services? That's a great new topic, but a long way again from being operational and practical in terms of planning practice. But we need to do a better job at figuring out how do we decide whether or not an area should be a marine protected area, and we can compare the values that are present in those areas compared with alternative uses of those areas. And hopefully MPAs will succeed where they are actually protecting ecologically and biologically important areas, but they won't in all cases until we get better at coming up with valuations of the natural services that we know exist in the marine environment. So with that topic or that comment on what we didn't talk about, I will quit. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup et merci à vous cinq pour
Thank you very much. Thanks to all five speakers for their contributions and for throwing light through their expert point of view. All this was very precious. Our apologies to the organizers, our apologies to the people who were planned to intervene at 6 o'clock. We're running a bit late. We're very sorry about this. It's our fault, it's our responsibility. So let me bring this meeting to an end very rapidly. I'll hope to see you all again tomorrow for the follow-up, the third day of our conference. And Patricio, I think, has a little announcement to make.
Well, to also join with our apologies of not preserving and keeping the time. I see Sylvia Earle sitting here in the first row, and Dan LaFoley sitting there. Immediately at 6 o'clock, you were supposed to be attending not to the closing remarks of this panel, but to the announcement of the hope spots here. So I am announcing warmly that the presenters are waiting, patiently for us to leave the scenario and leave them the room. But we invite you very heartily to stay to see and watch the release of this map today. And thank you for being patient, Sylvia, and thank you. Thank you so much.
Merci.